Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed a number of important developments. The most important one may be the current geographic distribution of the virus. After an initial decline of cases in majority of Northern Hemisphere countries, we have subsequently seen a significant increase of cases in the Southern Hemisphere. That pattern has significantly increased the risk of COVID-19 returning back into the Northern Hemisphere in the fall and following a seasonal pattern very much similar to other respiratory viruses, including other coronaviruses. With an increased level of risk of COVID-19 returning back in the second half of this year and potentially developing a persistent seasonal pattern for the foreseeable future, it is important to understand what are the current therapeutic and preventative modalities for dealing with COVID-19. In the therapeutic space, after the initial setbacks with a number of assets, including the widely publicized hydroxychloroquine, we have seen a success in pivotal trials of a lead asset in this area called remdesivir. While positive and approved currently, the data for remdesivir suggested a rather modest effect, mostly impacting the clinical course of the disease and the duration of hospitalization, without a clear signal of an improvement in mortality. The other modality that has since received an approval next to remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19 has been the convalescent-derived plasma, which contains antibodies that are used for the treatment of the disease, although that modality has been approved without conclusive clinical evidence. In the area of trying to deal with the complications of COVID-19 infection, there have been some notable setbacks, however also a remarkable success of one of the most widely available steroid treatments called dexamethasone, which has demonstrated an improvement in mortality for the severe COVID-19 patients. So these modalities are currently approved and being used in practice. What's interesting about a number of pipeline assets in development is some of the modalities that are being currently tested in pivotal trials, late-stage pivotal trials, specifically the so-called monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies allow for a very highly targeted treatment of COVID-19 and utilize the great advances that we've seen in the area of high-throughput sequencing as well as molecular biology. These assets are currently going through the final stages of testing, with potential data being available in the latter half of this year. In the area of prophylaxis, we are mostly focusing on the development of various vaccine modalities. Some of these vaccine modalities rely on traditional tools, typically being based on certain elements of the virus being extracted and provided to patients, while other more novel modalities rely on the actual genetic sequence of the virus. And in this space, one of the most exciting types of solutions are the so-called RNA vaccines, which are important because they are currently being tested in pivotal trials in the clinic. Before we get into some of the interesting early data that we have seen with the RNA-based vaccines so far this year, it is important for everyone to understand what are the key factors of a vaccine being successful. Well, number one, the vaccine itself has to boost a certain level of immunity. That level of immunity has to be sustained for a sufficiently long period of time. And lastly, the vaccine has to be safe. The RNA vaccines have so far demonstrated encouraging signs as they relate to the first element that I just mentioned, boosting of immunity. And here we have seen in small numbers of patients relatively high levels of the so-called neutralizing antibodies being created, which then imply a potential level of immunity against the virus in these patients. However, not only were the numbers small, the follow-up period was also relatively short. Hence, there are still significant risks that remain as they pertain to the potential efficacy of these products. And another risk factor is the safety. Here, one of the key safety events that we could possibly witness in the development throughout the conduct of these pivotal clinical trials is the so-called antibody-dependent enhancement phenomenon, where paradoxically, the production of antibodies by the immune system can actually increase the risk and severity of the infection itself. We will probably see the totality of that data coming from these pivotal trials with the RNA-based vaccines in the first half of next year, with the traditional approaches taking a significantly longer period of time.